Let's go ahead and start today, as we've been doing, with a recitation of the Heart Sutra. And this is, again, one of the shortest sutras that teaches on emptiness. I will allude to a few of the things in this sutra at some point during this course. But anyway, I think most of you are somewhat familiar with this sutra, so we'll go ahead and recite it. If you do have an awareness of emptiness already, some idea of what it means, try to bring that to mind as we recite these words together. I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on Massa Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. We'll do a short mandala offering. Again, this is symbolic of us offering everything that exists in this purified form, offering this to all the Buddhas, all the enlightened beings who are the same nature as our most holy teachers, His Holiness and so on, all the same nature, a purified mind. And we're making this vast offering so we can purify our own minds by receiving their blessings and inspiration. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then we'll do refuge and bodhicitta as we usually do, once in English, twice in the Tibetan, bringing to mind these 2 thoughts of refuge, finding safe direction in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, especially the Dharma that we're studying, which is the teachings of the perfection of wisdom, the teachings on emptiness, and then also generating the motivation of bodhicitta, which we'll also reflect on shortly in a meditation, but already cultivating that wish in your own mind to become a Buddha, and that thinking that you're here engaging in these teachings with that intention. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Druparsho. Okay, thank you, Mary, for sharing the prayers. Let's go ahead and do a short meditation then before we begin, as we usually do. So just spend a few minutes focusing on the breath. We talked about concentration in our last class and some of these factors. And maybe as you meditate on the breath, if you haven't been doing this throughout the week, just to pay attention to what's going on. It was a meditation that you were encouraged to use over the last week, but try to see if we can detect the level of mindfulness that we have, that of course will be together with our concentration, our single pointed focus on the breath. And then also this factor of introspection or vigilance that sort of checks in occasionally to see the quality of our meditation. And then, of course, if we've gotten very lax or dull, if the mind has gotten sleepy, then we bring the mind back up and bring it back to the breath. If the mind's gotten excited, distracted, wandering, then we bring it back down and once more refocus on the breath. So again, just spend a few minutes doing this, but being somewhat attentive to what's happening, because we'll talk about it just a little bit before we go on to the next topic, just reviewing a little bit of what we covered last Saturday. So I'll ring the chime to begin the meditation period, and just work with the breath in whatever way suits your mind, focusing wherever you need to use it as an object of meditation. Oh, there's my ringer. Okay, good. All right, so we'll begin. So now let's set our motivation for today's class. As we've been discussing, even in the first class of this series, the root problem that each of us is facing is that we are under the control of ignorance. We'll be exploring this ignorance more today. But in some ways, we could say this is actually a very slight mistake that we're making. But of course, we've never corrected this mistake. This mistake has been in our mind since beginningless time. We've never even questioned what it is that we're doing with this mind of ignorance, the way we are clinging to things, having existence from their own side, and so on. Again, some ideas we'll be exploring in today's class. But we've been making this error. And if the error didn't have any consequences, it wouldn't be a big deal. But the error has resulted in us going from life to life, continuing to be under the control of our karma and the other delusions that arise in the basis of this ignorance, even when we have generated positive states of mind because they were together with this ignorance. They only created results within the round of existence, within samsara. We've known the greatest joys that can be had within cyclic existence. We've experienced the worst sufferings there are to be experienced in samsara. And we've done everything in between. And the only reason why that has happened is because we haven't corrected this mistake. So the initial motivation that is an important part of our path is to really want this wisdom for ourselves, to want to undo this error that we're making conceptually, so that we ourselves can be free once and for all from our own ignorance, from our own other delusions, as well as the karma that is contaminated with that ignorance that keeps us bound up in cyclic existence in samsara, and attain the peace that we call nirvana, the peace of mind that will be there when we have removed all of these afflictions and will no longer be taking rebirth through the force of our own karma and delusions. So generate that first intention of engaging in these teachings on emptiness with that motivation. This is compassion for yourself. This is clearly understanding your own suffering and why it has occurred and wanting to be free of that. And then, as usual, we take into consideration the predicament that other beings are in. All the beings within cyclic existence are just like us. They've had this ignorance since beginningless time. They've been under the control of it, through the force of it. They simply keep creating the causes for their own stay within this state of samsara. They keep themselves from knowing true peace and liberation and enlightenment. So opening our heart to the welfare of all beings, think that we're here engaging in these teachings, not just for our own freedom from suffering, but to attain the state of Buddhahood, a state where we then will be fully qualified, have perfect wisdom, perfect compassion, perfect power to benefit all sentient beings, to lead them out of the darkness of their ignorance into the light of wisdom. I think that it's for this reason that you're here today, engaging in these teachings. Whoop, fell off my little stand. I have it on here. So good morning, everyone. Again, welcome to this third class. So again, in the first class, we just introduced this topic and we watched the video for Discovering Buddhism that had some interesting points in it that we'll be getting into a little bit more today. And then there was the last class where, since His Holiness talks about this, and I think it's always good to go back and at least discuss a little bit more about meditation and concentration. And Discovering Buddhism, it's module 2, so it's way back at the beginning. And obviously, people have been using meditation throughout this course, but nonetheless, it's good to talk about how do we advance that meditation to an even greater degree. So last week we talked about attaining this mind that we call calm abiding. Calm abiding being a meditative stabilization that is superior because it allows the mind to be undistracted, focusing on whatever virtuous object we wish to engage in without any distraction for as long as we wish. And of course, we've attained that sort of we talked about this at the tail end of the class, this suppleness or pliancy, which is hard for us to imagine because when we sit on our cushions, I'm sure the body doesn't feel so comfortable all the time. It might feel good for a little bit and then suddenly we start getting aches and pains and whatever, and it's hard to sit, or our minds just simply are not serviceable. And so when we've attained that state, we have complete serviceability of both of those factors. And the body, as we saw, feels as light as cotton. The mind feels very energized and has even a level of bliss to it that is, again, unlike anything we've known in this life. So we attain that state, though, not as an end in and of itself, but as a means to help us to utilize deeper concentration to focus on all the various teachings of the Buddha. We're going to look at it primarily in terms of, or we have looked at it primarily in terms of developing it for realizing emptiness, specifically because it's in the context of this teaching, this module on that topic. But throughout everything that we've studied on the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, we need very deep concentration to integrate that into our minds. Without that level of concentration, we can get teachings, to some degree. We understand them. We can even work with them. We can have some awareness of them in our lives. But to sort of change the fabric of our minds, we need much deeper realization. So were there any questions on last week on the practice of this meditation on single-pointed concentration that I was asking you to work with, or anything from last week that wasn't clear that requires any further investigation before we go on? Anyone? If not, then we'll keep moving forward. So again, we're using this wonderful book. I can't help but recommend this enough if you are wanting to kind of have a guide through this course, His Holiness, How to See Yourself as You Really Are. It's on the book list that should be out on the website, the Dropbox that you should be able to link to. We'll make sure that that's out there. I put all the files for this whole course out there. I may add one or two here or there, but I don't think so right now. I think everything is out there. So know that there is a reading list, and there's even a little reading and meditation assignment list that encourages you to read particular chapters of this as preparation or as a review for this course. So just know that this is a kind of the format that I'm using to some degree. I'm bouncing around a little because His Holiness begins by talking about ignorance and goes on to concentration and comes back to, anyway, bounces back and forth. Today we're actually going to be in the first few chapters looking at some of the things that he says there, and especially the reasoning of dependent arising. This is the topic for today. Know that in Buddhism, we essentially have a number of what we call reasonings. And this is the whole point of these types of investigations, is that we can actually come to understand the logic of why things have this quality we call emptiness. We're going to be going into this more today. The Buddha taught a number of these reasonings. This is because emptiness is not completely impossible to realize, even though we talk about it being this very esoteric, profound subject. And of course, when you realize it in a much more direct way through that union of calm abiding and special insight that I talked about last week, it's hard to express that in words because that is a non-conceptual, direct perception of emptiness, which is something, again, that we can't even relate to from our conceptual framework. But we can use our conceptual mind as a ladder to kind of get us to that realization. This is one of the wonders of the Buddha's teachings, is that he's essentially trying to reverse all of our incorrect thinking by giving us all of the information that we can change our thinking into what is more correct. Recall that there are many different mistaken ideas that we have that we are learning in discovering Buddhism how to correct. If we go back to the death and impermanence module, which was back at module 5, this was the idea of death is rooted in, which we would call gross impermanence, is rooted in subtle impermanence. The fact that everything is changing, everything that is cause, that arises from causes and conditions, is changing all the time. So this metal bowl, again, that I rang earlier, when I first bought it many years ago in San Francisco, it had a very different sheen to it. It didn't have all the little marks and tarnishes and things, what have you. It's changed a lot with that regard to that. But even at like a molecular and atomic and subatomic level, everything is constantly changing. Of course, they're seeing this through deeper and deeper investigation into the physical world. That's why His Holiness spends a lot of time with scientists, both that are doing research into the physical world as well as the world of mind science, working with neuroscience and what have you. So His Holiness, points out again that these are things that can be investigated and learned and understood. And science is a wonderful tool to help do some of this, to really get at the reality that we are blind to. We purchase things and we get into relationships and we have friendships, whatever, and we think that they're lasting and unchanging, but everything is constantly changing. This body that we have every single moment, cells changing, some cells dying, some new ones being generated, all cells going through a process of kind of arising and disintegrating and so on. This is just the nature of our physical world. So we're blind to that. They say the realization of impermanence is a good one to prepare our minds for realizing emptiness, because we get this idea that we are not correctly conceiving of everything, and can reverse that very easily. Of course, to get subtle impermanence at a very deep level is also a pretty profound undertaking. But we also have a lot of misunderstandings with regard to other things the Buddha teaches. Like when we talk about karma, karma being the mechanism by which we have various experiences. Well, people have a lot of different ideas about why they experience things. What was that book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? There's a lot of different ideas about why stuff happens. And in the theistic traditions, they have this idea that, as I interpret it, and I could be very wrong in the way that other people perceive it within those traditions, that there's a creator God who, of course, is sort of doling things out to some degree, is behind what we experience. My own mother often will say things like, when she's dealing with hard times, she'll say, "Oh, the good Lord only gives you what you can handle." This idea that you're being tested, or in some way, this is God's way of I don't know, keeping you on your toes. I have no idea. But this is one way of explaining why things happen to people. Of course, we have the physical reality of why things are going on, such as what we're understanding with the pandemic we're experiencing, the virus, the way it's transmitted, da 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 da, causes and conditions. We're not denying that all that's going on, but why does it happen to certain people? Why do certain people experience illness from this? Other people don't. Some people die from this. Other people spend, uh, just they have a hospital stay, but they come out. They don't die. They don't lose their life from this. We have many different causes and conditions in regard to that. Karma is what's guiding all of that experience. Of course, it's impossible for us to know karma to the degree that we can know emptiness, because karma is quite a complex subject. In fact, they say it's extremely hidden. Only a Buddha can know all the intricacies of karma and how it works. Emptiness is not, it's hidden, but it's not that hidden. It's like impermanence. We can understand subtle impermanence simply by directing our minds to it and reasoning through. Well, this piece of paper, when I first bought it, was really, really white, and now it's somewhat yellowed, because this is one that I probably printed out back in 2007 is the date on the top of this, when I first put my notes together for this course. So we have a lot of ways that we can reason through this. Well, emptiness is the same. We can reason through it. We can analyze. We can come to understand it. And then we can begin to address this false conception that we have. So the very first thing we have to do, and I'm going to go ahead and put on the screen the slides for today, so we can at least know what we're going to be talking about through today's class. So this outline, undermining fundamental ignorance with the reasoning of dependent arising, this is the main topic for today. That was on your course overview, the outline for the course. Today we're going to talk about first identifying ignorance, because as we go in deeper into these reasonings, we have to first understand what it is that we're trying to negate. What is it that we're trying to overcome? We've alluded to this a little bit, but I think it's important to spend a little more time on that, and His Holiness has a few chapters dedicated to that. Secondly, we're going to go into actually seeing the interdependence of phenomena with the reasoning of dependent arising, which will act as an antidote, is meant to act as an antidote to that ignorance. So this is a reasoning in and of itself that we'll go into today and that you can begin to use, and especially through the meditation that I'm assigning for today. The third is how that reasoning in particular helps us to overcome the two extreme views, but how we also have to be aware of these two extremes that will cause us not to get the correct view of emptiness, of the wisdom of emptiness that we're trying to generate. And then the fourth point that is raised very briefly by His Holiness, but I think it's nice to introduce here, is this idea of seeing phenomena as being like illusions, that there is an illusory quality to phenomena that is implicit in all of this that we'll begin to understand as well. So let's talk about identifying this ignorance. His Holiness goes into, in the very first chapter, he says it's called laying the ground for insight to grow. He talks about how this ignorance, and I think I may have mentioned this 2 weeks ago, it's not just an ignorance that is not knowing. A lot of us have ignorance around those sorts of things, right? Like if somebody says, oh, can you explain quantum mechanics to me? I would say, I'm ignorant of quantum mechanics. I don't have any idea. I have some idea. I mean, I've heard enough about, quantum this and quantum that to have some inkling. But if somebody was really to ask me to explain it, if I were to do a whole course on quantum mechanics, I'd say I'd have to do an awful lot more learning before I'd be qualified to do that because I'm ignorant of that. That's one way we use the idea of ignorance in Buddhism. And we even do have some of those um, kind of things present in our lives that the Buddhism would point out. Just what I was talking about earlier in regard to karma, we can say we have an ignorance of karma. Of course, we may also be substituting it with some other idea. Maybe we were brought up in a theistic tradition and we think that God is rewarding or punishing us based on various factors or what have you, and that's why we experience things. That would be more akin to what the ignorance is referred to here, which is actually a misknowing. So it's not just not knowing, it's a misknowing. It's actually overlaying something on to things that is not actually there. So in the case of this ignorance, not the ignorance that's not aware of karma, this ignorance certainly, yes, is not aware of the empty nature of all phenomena, but moreover, it overlays a level of concreteness, of solidity, of autonomy to things that they don't have at all. The terms that His Holiness uses, this is around pages 29 through 31, where he talks about identifying this ignorance. He says on page 29, this ignorance mistakenly assumes that people and things exist in and of themselves by way of their own nature, when they don't exist that way at all, of course. Another reference on page 30, he says that things have a sense of concreteness that in fact is not there. Another way he describes it, he says, through ignorance, what we see around us seems to exist independently, without depending on other factors for its existence. That phrase in particular I'm highlighting because that's what we're going to talk about today, is if we are acknowledging that the way that this ignorance is grasping things to have an independent existence, if we can come to understand that they have a dependent existence, that will actually refute that directly. But these are all different flavors or different ways that we can understand how this ignorance is grasping at things incorrectly, conceiving of things incorrectly. The fourth one I'll mention is on page 30 as well. He says, see things concretely and autonomously. The final one under page 31 that I'll point out under point 3 of, he has like at the end of each chapter, there's these little, or sometimes even in the middle of the chapters, but there's at the end of each section kind of a number of meditation points. He says they exist independent of thought. This is, of course, what we're going to get into today with this reasoning of dependent arising. But this whole idea of how ignorance is, it's again blind to the actual way that things exist, but it is mistakenly thinking things are real. I don't mind using that word real. I mean, we're not in the end denying all reality, because if we denied all reality, then the Buddha's teachings wouldn't have any foundation at all, right? There's no real me, no real you, no real Buddha, no real anything. What we're getting at, though, is the way we see real or reality is infused with these ideas because we've had this ignorance since beginningless time. So we think everything has its own autonomous identity, that it establishes itself. So when I pick up this bowl, again, it seems to have its own, metal bowlness, this brass, I assume brass bowl that is, used for ringing a chime for meditation and what have you. It seems to exist out here on the object, from its own side, by way of its own characteristics. These are all different ways of talking about this. It's got its own boldness that exists completely independent. That when I came to understand what a bowl was, which was, of course, many, many years ago, of course, we know what, like a bowl for cereal, like when you were a kid and you got your cereal in your little bowl and whatever, you probably learned what a bowl was then. But everything that has kind of a similar shape and what have you, we end up calling a bowl. This we might call a singing bowl, or I don't know what else. Let's just call it that. So the idea, though, is that when we learn what that is, it's almost as if we think it already was existing as that out here. We just had to learn to correctly identify it. And of course, once we identify it, that even solidifies more its appearance as existing out here on its own, having its own autonomous identity, completely independent. This is the ignorance that we're trying to get rid of. Now, of course, with various things, in our lives, we do get into problems and difficulties, but the main thing that we misconceive is this sense of an I, this person that we are holding on to so deeply. We'll get into that more even in next week's class when we talk a bit more about the reasoning that will help us to address more directly the emptiness of the I. But nonetheless, we'll touch on that a number of times today because it is the way in which we are getting into so much trouble. But this ignorance thinks that I, myself, all the phenomena in the world, everything that exists, all other people, that they exist in that independent, autonomous way, that they set themselves up, that they are completely independently existing. So this is what we're going to be getting into refuting today, but I want to talk a little bit more about, this ignorance before we get on to that. So this ignorance, again, as I said, we are then thinking of something that has no existence whatsoever, and we are imputing an existence on it that is contrary to that. So this is the mistake that we are making, is that we think that things exist in this way when they don't exist that way at all. Sometimes the example I use, I don't know if it's effective for everyone, but the example I use is like a child. Let's say there was a young child that was having, had seen like a movie or something and thought that there were monsters, really believed in monsters. And so the child at night, you take the child upstairs to go to their room, and they would be just terrified that there are monsters in the room, right? This is a mistaken conception, right? It is adhering to grasping at something that doesn't exist at all. The child is believing in monsters, and on the basis of those monsters is having all kinds of fear, thinking that their own lives are in danger, thinking that the monster is going to get them, going to hurt them, going to harm them, whatever. So the child doesn't sleep well, the child is screaming a lot, is having a really hard time. And it's painful as a parent watching a child go through this because you know that there are no monsters. You've already, discerned that reality, but the child nonetheless has a firm belief in those monsters. So what do you have to do to show this child that the monsters don't exist, to get them to kind of, get to a place where they will no longer have that misconception, is to demonstrate the inaccuracy of that conception, the fact that what they are believing in, what they are grasping at, is non-existent. So what you would do with a child, of course, is you get your flashlight out, and go to all the dark corners of the room, of course, turn on all the lights at first so that, there's no way that the monster could be in any of the visible spots. And then you go into the darker spots of the closet or under the bed or whatever, and you shine the flashlight under there and you show the little kid that there's no monster in the room. The monsters aren't there. And so eventually the child may need repeated exposure to this kind of analysis, which is really what it is. It's analyzing, looking everywhere, trying to find the monster and not finding the monster till the child eventually realizes the emptiness of the monster, which is simply the lack of an existent monster. Now it's a little different again because we're when we get to talking about this ignorance, there is some level of reality still that again we can't completely abolish reality, or nothing would make any sense. This is something we're going to talk about later when we talk about these extreme views. But nonetheless, for the child who believes in the monster, this is a very effective way to undermine that belief, is to show that there are no monsters. And eventually the child will get to a place where it realizes, no, there's no monsters. What I was believing in was fictitious. What's again the same thing with regard to ourselves. We have been adhering to things existing, especially ourselves, in that concrete, independent way. We need to be shown that things don't exist in that way. This is what we mean by emptiness. Emptiness means the lack of any independent identity. Remember, Jan Willis was talking about that very clearly. She said things exist dependently, therefore they lack any independent entity or identity. They don't have that from their own side. Their existence is dependent upon other factors. This is again where we're going to in terms of today's analysis. But this is how we actually, and we can do other analyses, which we'll do, and next week we'll do a different analysis that will help us to undermine our ignorance even further. But we have to introduce correct thinking. We have to introduce the light of wisdom, just like the light of the flashlight that shines in the corner of all the rooms that shows that there is no monster. We have to do that with regard to our own views. So this is actually how our ignorance is uprooted. Ignorance is a conceptual mind. It is a subjective awareness that is holding on to an object. In this case, let's say, the bowl. It thinks that the bowl has its own boldness from its own side. It exists out there on its own, independent of all these factors. How do we get rid of that ignorance? Not by simply denying the ignorance, but by getting rid of the object it's grasping onto. Just like how do you get the child to be free of their fear? Is because you show that what that fear of thinking there's a monster in the room, what it's holding on to is this monster that is non-existent. Well, if you show that the monster is non-existent, if you actually show that what they are holding on to, thinking that there's a real monster in the room, if you show that that doesn't exist at all, then you undermine their ignorance. Then you help the child to be able to sleep at night because the child no longer has any fear, because it doesn't, it knows that what it was believing in before is non-existent. So it's the same idea here. How do we get rid of our own ignorance? By disproving the object of that ignorance, what that ignorance is adhering to. In fact, in Buddhism, we call these both objects of negation. The object of negation, the main one that we're working with in our reasonings, is this real thing that we're holding on to out here. This real eye or real bowl or real, chair, real person, whatever the case might be. We think that that reality is out there. It doesn't exist that way at all. It has never existed that way. This is a completely false conception, just like the child believing in the monster. There never was a monster. Maybe there was some, something in the corner that based on the shadows, it looked like a monster, but it never was a real monster. There was no real monster. In this case, we are adhering to things being real in this way, and they've never existed that way. Not for 1 second. So if we prove that this object of negation out here doesn't exist, then we've undermined the ignorance that's adhering to that, and that gets negated then. This is an object of negation that actually does exist. Your ignorance does exist. Your ignorance exists or you wouldn't be here in samsara. If you didn't have this ignorance, you wouldn't be going from life to life, experiencing all the various things. That ignorance does exist. It too is negated, but it is negated by negating something that didn't even exist in the first place. It's kind of weird to say an object of negation that never existed. But this is the problem. We're adhering to something as real that isn't actually real. It's the same as the example with the child, right? Adhering to there being a real monster in the room when there is no real monster in the room. And as a parent, again, you can look at that child and say, oh, you poor thing, you're just believing in something that isn't true at all. Well, this is what the Buddhas are doing. They're looking at all of us and they're going, these poor sentient beings, they're believing in stuff that never existed at all, not for 1 second. This is why it can be undermined, is because the object it's grasping to can be refuted, can be negated. And by virtue of that, we can be free of the ignorance. We can be free of that factor that is keeping us involved in cyclic existence. So as I said, there are a lot of different things that we are misconceiving in our lives that the Buddha is pointing out the error of our ways. Another one, just I was pointing out impermanence, I was pointing out karma, but even the one that the Buddha teaches in, we did this in Module 9 when that was taught. Module 9 was focusing on the idea that, again, there is samsara and nirvana, what we are involved in samsara. We have to clearly understand that. And we looked at the Four Noble Truths. The very first truth was the truth of dukkha, or suffering as it's often called. But dukkha is a better word in some ways, because the second level of dukkha was how kind of addressing our misconception around pleasure. We think that everything that is pleasurable is inherently pleasurable, but it isn't actually. Conventionally, it doesn't even have that nature. It does arise with a pleasant feeling, but it doesn't have any true nature of pleasure. Why? Because it's still unsatisfactory. all those things that we go to that, give us great pleasure in the sensory world, those things don't last. They're very transitory. And if we actually engage in them as thinking they're a true source of happiness, continually engage in them thinking our happiness will get better and better, greater and greater, they actually lead to pain and difficulty. I mean, this is what maybe I hope none of you did, but some people do on Thanksgiving, right? They just keep eating more and more food, thinking that the food is so pleasurable that they just have greater pleasure. At some point, it becomes painful. Maybe little kids do that more than adults would. They just kind of keep eating food and don't realize that it's leading to them to have a stomach ache because they can't possibly, do that comfortably. This is the whole thing about our existence. We don't ever find any lasting happiness, but this is a misconception that we have, that we think all these things are true sources of happiness. That's another misconception we have. But anyway, that's just another example of how the Buddha was pointing out a lot of different forms of ignorance that we have. This one that we're working with in this course, though, is the deepest form of ignorance. It is what is giving us all of our problems and difficulties, what is causing us to engage in karma, by which we then experience various levels of suffering and dissatisfaction. So His Holiness goes into later in that first section, first few chapters, chapter 3, he's got about, why understanding the truth is needed. I think that's obvious from what I already talked about, but essentially, this is the importance of all these teachings, is that if we are ever to be free of our own ignorance, that is mistakenly grasping at things in this way, we have to do this. But if we are ever to help others to do this, we have to be clear about that wisdom ourselves. That's why for the Bodhisattva in particular, this is a huge undertaking, is to do this investigation into emptiness and to learn as many reasonings as possible and ways of approaching emptiness as possible, so that we then can help others to realize this. Because just like the parent who knows that their child is losing sleep and causing them to, be upset and whatever, crying a lot because they believe in this monster, we can, and the parent has great compassion and doesn't want their child to suffer and doesn't want, that error to be causing all the suffering. So they have to disprove what that mind is believing in, the mind of that child. So too, we should feel the same for our fellow sentient beings, because we look at them and we realize that in essence, their suffering is unnecessary. Your suffering is unnecessary. Every being's suffering is unnecessary. If everyone could simply remove this fictitious conception, this, conception that is adhering to things as real in this way. So we're going to get more into defining what that looks like in terms of, especially today, by going into the reasoning of dependent arising. Again, His Holiness has a whole section then that follows. It's all about the kind of interdependence of things. So what I've touched on here already, and I didn't go into great depths, is like the first part, which covers the first 3 chapters. On page 49 is actually where chapter 4 begins. This is the second part, and this is what he calls how to undermine ignorance. So he even goes into all of this, like I said, before he goes into concentration, which was part 3. But nonetheless, we went through part 3, or the concentration teachings, last week, because I really like to introduce them before we go into the emptiness teachings. But what His Holiness essentially is doing in this part 2 is he's primarily using this reasoning that, again, we've called the reasoning of dependent arising or dependent origination. It's kind of seeing, as he says there, the interdependence of things, that things don't have a way of existing kind of on their own, autonomously, all these phrases that we use to refer to this fictitious way of existing. So His Holiness says, if our misunderstanding of things entails seeing them as independent, then one of the principal means of overcoming this mistaken outlook is to reflect on the fact that all phenomena arise dependently. Remember, this is, I pointed this out just a few minutes ago, that this is how Jan Willis approaches the topic of emptiness, is that she says we think that things exist independently. If we can understand that they exist dependently, then we have discerned the truth of things. We come to understand how things actually do exist, and we undermine the ignorance that thinks that things exist independently. So when we see it in those very simple terms, it actually does seem like, what's the big deal? I can understand that things are existing dependently, and I mistakenly think they exist independently. It seems like, quite obvious. Well, then we should be able to free ourselves from this quite easily. Nonetheless, this does take repeated analysis, and again, on the basis of having deeper concentration, to be able to have it really hit home, to have it really alter our minds to that degree, to where we are actually free of that ignorance. But nonetheless, the reasoning of dependent arising is said to be one of the most effective, because it helps us to understand how things actually do exist, so that we then don't fall into the extreme that we're going to talk about a little bit later, what we call the extreme of annihilation, or the extreme view of nihilism, where we think things don't exist at all. This is a very, kind of careful analysis that we have to go through to make sure that we find this, what's called the middle way. Oftentimes these teachings are referred to as the Madhyamaka, or the middle way teachings, because they do allow us to find that middle path that will help us to avoid any erroneous views, anything that will kind of take us into an unhealthy place. So we'll get into that a little bit later. What I want to do to introduce dependent arising, because we're going to talk about the various levels that the Buddha expressed the way that things arise dependently. And this is, again, just to help us to understand how things exist, and thereby undermine any form of their independent existence. So I like to use, and some of you have seen me do this before, my trusty clothespin. Okay, so you can see it up there. I'll put it up close to just an ordinary clothespin people use. Clothespin is defined, by the way, as a clip of wood or plastic for fastening clothes to a clothesline. Of course, we can use this for a lot of different things. Sometimes, like if I have some tortilla chips or something in a bag, I'll put it on the bag to keep them fresh, or something like that, right? But nonetheless, this is what this was designed for. It has that function. Adam at the center, he was reading a National Geographic some years ago when I think he was traveling or something, and he still had it. And he'd mentioned to me when I used this at a class at TNL one time, he said, "Oh, I've got this article I saw when I was reading this National Geographic. It's the history of the clothespin. There's actually a whole display at the Smithsonian." And it was kind of interesting. I have it here somewhere. He gave it to me. And anyway, the idea is that, oh, here it is. It's I won't get it out. But anyway, this thing's evolved, right? It started off, I mean, even when I was growing up, it didn't have the metal clip necessarily. It was more like a wooden peg. It was more like a closed peg that you would just put on the line like that. And that's how you actually fasten things, rather than fastening them with this, spring action thing. So anyway, we've come to know this as a clothespin. Let's see how this clothespin really exists. Now, again, clothespins aren't our big problem. I'm only using this as an example. We don't have a lot of attachment and problems arising around clothespins. We don't have, huge wars breaking out over a clothespin. This isn't, the main problem in our lives. But nonetheless, it's a good example. And I like working with it because it can be easily assembled and disassembled. So let's talk about first, the very first level of how clothespin arises. This is where we talk about how it is dependent upon causes and conditions. So let's go into a bit of the causes and conditions that lead us to having what's in my hand, this clothespin, okay? First of all, we have the more substantial causes of this, which in the case of the two pegs, these two sides of it that are wooden, it would be, of course, the wood of the tree that these are made from. So a tree was cut down at some point, and parts of that tree were fashioned into these little, pegs that go together that make the pegs of the clothespin. Then we also have, of course, the more substantial cause of the, metal spring here. That would be, of course, metal ore that came out of, the rocks or the earth, and it was melted down and fashioned into this spring thing. But then we, of course, have lots of other conditions that led to this, right? You had the person, as I said, Adam was pointing out in this article, all the various steps that designing it and redesigning it. And it has come to be known as a clothespin that looks like this now. And if somebody brought one of those clothespins from the 1800s to me, I might not even recognize what it is. But the idea is that this is a factor that led us to having this, right? People who designed this, who there was a necessity, people who were hanging clothes, who needed to put those clothes out to dry on the line in the days before dryers. So some people still dry their clothes outside. It's actually kind of nice in the summer to dry them outside, right? They dry very quickly in New Mexico with the hot dry air. But anyway, we have, a need for these. And so somebody came up with the design and the idea behind a clothespin. There, of course, are many other things involved in the factories where these are made. You have the factory workers who oversee the machine line where all of these various little pegs are being produced, as well as the clips or the spring. And then, of course, the people who assemble them, I assume that, again, they have to be assembled to some degree. I don't know that a machine does that. Maybe a machine does that now. But nonetheless, you have the machine operators. You have the person who designed the machine. You even have the food that the person ate who's at the machine line, who's overseeing the assembly of these. You have many factors involved in creating a clothespin. So we could go on forever. I could take the rest of this class and talk about all the various causes and conditions that have led to this clothespin being here. Does a clothespin exist independent of those causes and conditions? No. I mean, we don't think about all the causes and conditions unless we turn our mind towards them. But you couldn't have this clothespin in my hand if all those causes and conditions weren't here, if they didn't precede this coming into existence. So it has no independent existence apart from its causes and conditions. Now, again, when people hear this for the first time, they might think, well, so what's the big point, Don? But there is a deeper relevance to this that we'll come back around to. But we have to go into the other levels of dependent arising to do that first. So let's talk about the second level in which this clothespin is dependent upon other factors. The way that we're going to talk about it is its dependence upon parts. So when we talk about this clothespin, as I've been doing, I've been talking about three main parts, right? Three larger parts. We have, call it the right, because as you're facing, it's on my left, but the right peg, the left peg, and then the spring. Of course, every one of those parts has infinite numbers of other parts. As I was saying earlier, all these scientists that are going down into the atomic and subatomic levels, you could find infinite parts behind any part of this, much less the whole thing. And of course, even within any one of these parts, the clothespin has its little, this little what would you call it, notch right there where the spring fits into. It's got two little notches here. I don't know what those are for, except to help you to grip it, I guess. And then you have the little round part where that goes on the cord, and then you have the beveled part here that I guess allows it to slide a little bit easier onto the cord. And so you have various things that were designed in it. And so we can talk about any one of those particular parts and say, oh, the tip of this, or the curl of the spring, or whatever the case might be. You can go into all the various parts. And there's, again, infinite parts, just as there were infinite causes. So the question arises once more on the basis of that investigation. Does a clothespin exist independent of its parts? Can you have the parts of the clothespin over here and the clothespin over there and have a complete independence of the two? No. You have to have the parts of the clothespin to have the clothespin. Without the parts there, you wouldn't have a clothespin. Right? I mean, it makes sense? Okay. You get that one too, and you kind of go, okay, Don, so what's the point? I mean, let's take a little deeper look at this whole thing. And to do this, we're going to disassemble it. We're going to take it apart. So I first take off the left, I take off the right. So I'm holding all three parts here, okay? So I'll hold these over here, and I'm going to talk about what's over here in this hand. Is this a clothespin? All right? No. Okay. So, well, we'll drop it right there. Is this a clothespin? No. Is this a clothespin? Okay, no. So we have no clothespin kind of in those three parts. Let's talk about, though, when we assemble it. So I'm going to put it back together. Again, I'll do this right in front of you so you know I've got nothing up my sleeve, nothing I'm doing tricky here. This little piece goes right there. So now is there a clothespin in my hand? So where did clothespin come from? It wasn't in the right peg. It wasn't in the spring. It wasn't in the left peg. And I put it together, but I didn't add anything. Did I add like some fourth thing that's the clothespin that like put it on this collection of stuff? Yes, I assembled it. I mean, without a doubt, things have to be assembled in a way. I mean, somebody working at a clothespin factory knows that if you don't put all the parts together, you don't have the clothespins. You can't fill up a bag of clothespins and send them out to the stores that are going to sell them. If you went to the store and you bought all of these pieces of clothespins, That'd be very different than buying the clothespins in a sense. I mean, you'd be maybe take them back and say, look, they didn't assemble any of these clothespins. These are all just the parts of a clothespin. But once you put the parts together, clothespin is there, but clothespin didn't come from anything in the physical parts. There wasn't a clothespin on that one, on the spring, or on the left peg. None of these pegs, none of the springs have clothespin within them. Where does clothespin come from? So what we come to understand is that what I have in my hand is simply the basis for clothespin. Clothespin is the thought, the label, the idea we give to this collection of stuff. Now, in other words, I don't even have a real clothespin in my hand. I have the parts of a clothespin. Clothespin is an idea, a thought that we came up with through our conventional usage and our conventional understanding. Again, as I said, there were all these various causes and conditions that led clothespins to exist. People had clothes. Those clothes needed to be washed. Those clothes needed to be hung out to dry. Something needed to be there so that the wind wouldn't blow them away. All these various things that led to us conceiving of clothespin and coming up with clothespin, and it went through its evolution, as Adam pointed out in the National Geographic article from the Smithsonian Institute, all the various ways, iterations of what has come down to be known as a clothespin. And all of that was merely imputed, merely designated, merely a conceptual thought around what this object was. There's no real clothespin in my hand, because otherwise I would have found it. And even if I look at it on this collection of parts, this is a collection of parts, right? We have at least the three main parts here. As I said, every one of these parts has infinite numbers of smaller parts, the flat side, the round side, whatever, all these various parts that we can look at. We cannot find a real clothespin on any of these parts, nor on the collection of the parts. So where is the real clothespin? The real clothespin doesn't exist. It's just a thought, a designation that we give to this. So we once more arrive at the question that we did for the other ones. Is there a clothespin that exists independent of being labeled as clothespin, thought of as clothespin, conceived of as clothespin? No, because again, I can't find clothespin to exist on any of those parts. Rather, clothespin is the label, the idea we adhere to this, subscribe to this, as soon as it comes into that suitable basis for being a clothespin. So that's where in the last sort of level of dependent arising, we end up talking about what's in my hand, as I said a few minutes ago, as simply the basis for imputing or designating clothespin. Clothespin itself is the thought, the concept that we give to this. And Jeffrey Hopkins, in one of his books, it's not on your book list because it's a pretty heavy, bit more advanced book. It's called Emptiness Yoga. He says in that book, he says, if we don't get that the label and the basis are actually two different phenomena, we haven't really gotten the import of this type of analysis. We haven't really understood that this is what's going on. What I think of as clothespin, the idea of clothespin, and it's not just the words clothespin, it's the whole idea that we have behind this, right? That is informed by our history of clothespin and needing this, object that we can hang our clothes on a clothesline with. All of that informs what we mean by clothespin. That is all just a conceptual phenomenon. It's a phenomenon. It exists because we can validly posit what is a clothespin. And then there is the basis in my hand, which is the basis for that label. Those are actually two separate phenomena. Related, obviously, because the label clothespin applies to this that's in my hand. But what's in my hand is the basis for a clothespin, not an actual clothespin, a real clothespin. Now, again, that for it to really hit home, we have to get that level of import, that what is in my hand is simply the basis for designation. The way that clothespin exists is simply as a label. Now, of course, as I said earlier, clothespins are not the problem, unless, of course, we get really attached to it. Like if I start thinking, oh, this is my clothespin. Maybe if you're dealing with like a clothespin shortage, I don't know if there's a clothespin shortage with the pandemic, but, then you might get really possessive of your clothespins, right? You might get very attached to them and think, oh, I can't let any of them go. My neighbor wants to borrow my clothespin so they can dry their clothes, but if I give them mine, where will I get mine from? So we can have some delusions around clothespins, But as I said, the biggest illusion is around me, around I. So when we get back after the break, we're going to take a short break. I want to talk a little bit more about how dependent arising applies to the self, to the person, so that we can begin to undermine this most fundamental ignorance, which is our clinging to me existing in this independent way, that then causes me to have all my delusions, to create my karma and so on. But it's the same basic logic that we would apply to a clothespin, or that we would apply to a metal bowl, or that we would apply to a book, or whatever phenomenon that we choose to apply this. The reasoning of dependent arising can be done for everything, because everything is a dependent arising. So I'll review that with regard to the person, and we'll also take a little bit deeper look at this reasoning when we return. So I have 11:35. Let's just go to 11:45 then, give you about 10 minutes. Oh, just turned to 11:36, sorry, 9 minutes. So let's just start at 11:45, and then we'll go till 12:30. Okay, I will see you shortly. Okay, so before I ask for any questions, let me just do a review of the levels of dependent arising once more with regard to the person. Because as I said, this is the real root of all of our problems and difficulties, is that we don't get involved in things like clothespins or bowls or any of the various things, computers, phones, until we have this strong sense of a person that is the owner of all those things, that wants all those things, and that says, no, you can't have my clothespin. There aren't enough clothespins to go around right now. I have to hold on to all my clothespins because they're mine. This is that sense of a me that is the owner of things, that is rooted in the sense of the I, that is the biggest problem that we're dealing with. The fact that we're holding on to this I in this very concrete, independent way. As I said, next week we'll go into the more detailed analysis that investigates that I and sort of picks it apart and tries to really understand it, and how it exists and so on. But right now, let's just examine how you yourself, the phenomena that you call I, how this exists as a dependent arising. So we first of all, of course, have all the causes and conditions that have led to you being here. Of course, you do have a mind and a body, so any of the causes and conditions that led to that body being here, to your mind being here, are involved in that. So of course, it all started, in terms of this existence, when the two cells from your parents united in the womb of your mother. And that was the beginning of this physical basis, what has developed into the body that you have and continue to have until death happens. That was the beginning of the physical basis for you, of the body. And then, of course, in Buddhist terms, what happens is the mind conjoins with that, enters into that fertilized ovum, and then kind of develops, or is part of that development process, and is still moment by moment together with this body. You have all the causes that led to you being here right now, which of course are everything that influenced your life, that brought you to this stage of your development and so on. We have many things that have been involved, all the food that we've eaten, all the exercise we've done for these bodies, all the various, even the liquids we've drank, that have kept the liquids in this body, the moisture in this body, and so on, all the various things. I mean, we have so many that we could point to, again, various causes and conditions that have led to you being here right now, this person that you think of as I, this, basis. So again, everything that was involved in the basis for these things is, of course, involved in you being here. Now, again, in Buddhist terms, you'd also have the karma, karma being a main factor that also contributes to your being who you are in this existence. Having had the parents that you had, having a human existence, having all these various things are all karmically conditioned. So there are, in Buddhist terms, infinite numbers of causes and conditions that have led you to have all the various experiences that have produced who you are, that is part of this sense of I that you have right now. So once more, just as we did with the clothespin, we can ask, is there an I, a person, who's independent of all those causes and conditions? Absolutely not. I mean, without those causes and conditions, we wouldn't be here. Especially the main ones, the substantial cause for our body, the substantial cause for our mind, which of course is the previous moments of mind for our body. It's the two cells uniting in the womb of our mothers. Without those main causes, you of course wouldn't be here, but with all the other additional conditions and factors that have led you to being here, you wouldn't be able to, think of I here right now. Okay, so that's the first level. You also exist in dependence upon your parts. The I has the two main parts, which we just pointed out, the body and the mind. There's, again, within the body, infinite number of parts. And that's actually the meditation that you're going to work with Venerable Rabina for a little publication called Spiritual Friends, Meditations of the IMI Monks and Nuns, the International Mahayana Institute, which is our organization for our ordained folks. They put together a book many years ago, and one of the meditations in there is Venerable Rabina going into the dependent arising, looking at the body as the basis for that. So we can see that there are many factors involved in the body being here. Again, the substantial ones that were, creating it and so on, those sorts of beginning parts and what have you. But in any particular moment of this body, we can also talk about all the various parts that have arisen from those original causes. So those parts of your body are also a part of you. When we think of I, we think of the I in relation to this body. So we have a head, we have our torso, we have our limbs, we have within the head, the eyes and the nose and the tongue, the mouth, ears, and so on, all these various things. And we have within the eye, the retina and the cornea and various things. And then within the cornea, you have various parts. I'm not a physiologist, so I can't really tell you all the various parts of all the different organs of the body. But nonetheless, you have infinite parts, because even when you get down into the cells and the cellular parts, then again, those can be broken down further into various matter, and then that matter can be broken down further, and you can get into that whole same analysis. That's the physical component of your being, that part. Then you have the mental part. And we might think, well, we just have mind. Mind seems pretty unitary. Well, it is a sort of a unitary thing that we're referring to, but it has many different parts to it. We have five sense consciousnesses, our eye, ear, nose, tongue, body consciousnesses. We have our mental consciousness, which is, of course, what we're using now in thinking about things, but you're getting all the words that I'm saying through your auditory consciousness and then translating them into ideas in your mental consciousness. We also have all the various parts of any particular moment of mind. These we studied at TNL earlier this year and end of last year. I think on Wednesday nights we went into what are called the mental factors, which I introduced in Discovering Buddhism way back in module number 1, Mind and Its Potential. Mental factors are kind of the functional components of our mind. The factor of feeling, which is not, all of our range of emotions. It's the feeling tone that we have in response to any particular thing that we experience. Sometimes we have a very pleasant feeling tone, sometimes an unpleasant feeling tone, sometimes a neutral feeling tone. Well, those are all registrations on our mental landscape that are simply a part of any moment of mental experience. And we have, of course, all of our delusions. Those are parts of our mind, right? Our anger, our attachment, our jealousy, our pride. We have our positive states of mind, our compassion, our love, our, faith, all the various factors that are very wholesome to generate. And then we even have some more neutral factors. We have, various things going on in our mind that are part of the mental landscape. You have infinite parts of your mind as well. So if you have infinite parts of your mind, you have infinite parts of your body, is there an I that exists independent of all those parts? No, rather it exists in dependence upon all those parts. We have this whole that we designate as I that is related to the parts that are involved in all the parts of you, the parts of your being. Again, which we can say simply our mind and body, but even those have, all their myriad parts. His Holiness on this whole thing, when he talks about parts, he says here, they still seem to have their own entities. There's a conflict between the way the whole and its parts appear and the way that they actually exist. So even at this level, we can begin to get this idea that there's something that we call a whole that seems to have its own independent identity, but yet we can acknowledge it depends upon its parts. And these two, we seem to kind of fuse together, and we think that the whole is the parts. This is part of our mistaken ignorance. Really, again, when we get to that third level of understanding of dependent arising, we come to see that what we designate as the whole, which is the I in this case that we designate to this collection of stuff, and this collection of stuff they're not equivalent. The I is simply a label. It is an idea that we have in regard to this collection of stuff. Just like we saw with clothespin, there's no clothespin in each of the parts independently, When the parts are all together and assembled, then we think of that as clothespin, but it's nothing more than the thought of that as clothespin. There's no real clothespin on any of these parts. There's no real you on any of the parts that are the basis for your being. So there's no real you in your body. There's no real you in your mind. This is what we're going to look at next week, is that type of analysis, to go looking for that real me. But here we come to understand that the way that the I actually exists is very, very subtle. Now, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he teaches on emptiness, he frequently says, it's almost as if the I doesn't exist, because the I is just a thought we have in relation to this collection of stuff. And if we really get this, this is, of course, a much deeper level of understanding. You know, what was the word that Robert Heinlein used in Strangers in a Strange Land, or Stranger in a Strange Land? I can't remember what the name of that book was even. Anyway, he used the word grok, I think, right? Grok. So it's become part of our vernacular of grok. Do you grok it? Do you get it? Do you really get it at a deep level? If we really grok this, really get this at a deep level, then there is no I that we have to protect. There is no I that we get into trouble over. That strong sense of an I, that all of this is happening around, that I was speaking to earlier today, that is completely undermined. And we get that the way that the I exists in this very, very subtle way isn't enough in the end for all these delusions to arise. It will undermine those delusions. It'll undermine our ignorance. We won't have any attachment. We won't have any anger, because there's no I here to protect and defend and take care of and what have you. That I that exists is only existing in this very nominal way, whereas we think it's so much more substantial than that. So this is the point behind this reasoning of dependent arising, is to get us to a recognition that by depending upon all of these factors, the I cannot be independently existing, nor can any phenomenon be independently existing. Because when it depends upon other factors for its existence, by virtue of that, it denies its independence. These are a dichotomy. If something is independent, it cannot be dependent. If it is dependent, it cannot be independent. And this is true with all of these sorts of dichotomies that we can find in our world. If something is permanent, unchanging, well, then it cannot be impermanent and changing. Changing and unchanging are mutual opposites. They are directly contradicting each other. So this is what we're going to be, kind of getting into in this reasoning of dependent arising, or what we've gotten into and what we need to investigate in terms of our own analysis. So let's go back to the slides and I'll recap what we went through. The first of these, dependence upon causes and conditions, I went into this a little bit on Wednesday night, but know that there are some phenomena that don't depend on causes and conditions. Now, again, phenomena is the largest bucket of everything. It means everything that exists. Of those things that exist, some do depend upon causes and conditions, and they are actually what we call impermanent phenomena. Those causes and conditions are behind them. They come into existence, they change throughout their existence, and they often change into something else. Change and causes and conditions are kind of mutually inclusive. They are absolutely part and parcel of each other. Some things in our world are not caused, though. And one example is emptiness. Emptiness itself is not a caused phenomenon. It doesn't have its causes and conditions. It is a negation, again, a lack of independent existence. So if it is a lack of independent existence, that lack doesn't depend upon causes and conditions. It is simply a negation. And that negation is constant throughout the duration of that emptiness. It doesn't have its own changing nature. So it becomes an unchanging, permanent phenomenon. Again, I'm just explaining this in the briefest of ways, since I don't want to get it too complicated. But for most of what we deal with in our world, our computers and our phones and people and our bodies and everything else around us, all these physical things, as well as even our own minds, all of these arise in dependence upon causes and conditions because they are impermanent. Impermanent in Buddhism, once more, means changing moment by moment. I alluded to that a little bit earlier, that reality that we are often even blind to, that things do have that nature. Everything that arises from its conditions and respective causes, all of this is impermanent. It will change moment by moment. But that momentary change is something, again, that we don't realize right off the get-go. But this first level of dependent arising only applies to those sorts of phenomena. Again, all the things in our physical world, as well as, of course, our own minds. It could even apply, certainly, to some phenomena that are in a third category, such as time. Time is not a mind, it's not a physical phenomenon, but time is a changing phenomenon, right? It's changing all the time. Moment by moment, time goes on. What is the single present moment becomes the past, arising from the future. The future becomes the present and then goes into the past. The past is the product of something that was in the present that arose from the future. Anyway, the three times, these are all something that we can see as an impermanent phenomenon, but it's not matter, nor is it mind. So we have many phenomena that would fit into this category. We talked today about the clothespin. We talked about the eye. Both of those are phenomena that depend upon causes and conditions. The second is a level of dependence upon parts. And I don't need to go into all that again, but know that, again, that's a way to set us up for the third level. Because when we get into this idea of dependence upon conceptuality, imputation, designation, labeling, here what it means is a mind has to be involved in giving a designation to those parts. Those parts are the basis of designation, the basis of imputation or labeling, and we give that label to it. So we look at this collection of parts that are, referred to as I, and we come to see that those are simply thought of as I, that those parts don't have any identity as I from their own side. They don't exist in that independent way as I. I'm going to share one more thing with you I think that might be useful. This is from a different book by His Holiness called Ethics for the New Millennium, which you might think, well, what does this book on ethics have to do with dependent arising? But His Holiness talks about the interdependence of things there as a way of reinforcing our view of ethics. And actually, he does that a little bit in How to See Yourself as You Really Are, the book we're using for this course. But he says here, as a means to understanding this complexity of the world and the world that we're living in, he says, I find the concept of dependent origination, which again is the same as what we've been calling dependent arising. In Tibetan, it's tenda, articulated by the Madhyamika, again, the middle way school of Buddhist philosophy. That's what I mentioned earlier, this middle way, and I'll be talking about that more when we go on to the next topic, which is talking about these extreme views that we have to find the middle way between. So he says he finds this concept of dependent arising to be particularly helpful. And of course, in our Buddhist path of realizing emptiness, it's extremely helpful. According to this, he says, we can understand how things and events come to be in three different ways. At the first level, the principle of cause and effect, whereby all things and events arise in dependence on a complex web of interrelated causes and conditions, is invoked. So this is the first level, as we invoke that principle of causality, of things coming into existence on the basis of causes and conditions. He says this suggests that no thing or event can be construed as capable of coming into or remaining in existence all by itself. Many factors are behind all of this. For example, if I take some clay and mold it, I can bring a pot into being. The pot exists as an effect of my actions, right? This is why pots exist, is because people design them into, take clay, especially these homemade pots and what have you, not talking about like produced things on a factory line necessarily. But, someone like His Holiness is explaining here would take clay and molds it maybe on a potter's wheel and brings a pot into being. At the same time, he says, the pot is also the effect of a myriad of other causes and conditions. These include the combination of clay and water to form its raw material. Beyond this, we can point to the coming together of the molecules, atoms, and other minute particles which form these constituents, which are themselves dependent on innumerable other factors, everything arising in dependence upon various factors. Whoops. Oh, sorry, I hit the home. How did I do that? Let me take it off screen and find, rather than doing that I'll go back to that. Yeah, I think what I have to do is just get out of that, and then I go back and start here. Yeah. Okay. All right, now I'm there. Okay, so now I got to do is share this. Causes and conditions, right? There we go. And let me do from the current slide. So he says, then there are the circumstances leading up to my decision to make a pot. And there are the cooperative conditions of my actions as I give shape to the clay. All these different factors make it clear that my pot cannot come into existence independently of its causes and conditions. Rather, it is dependently originated. I'm actually going to take it off again for just a moment. His Holiness even does talk about how, once more, because in that book he's referring to it in the context of ethics, but even in our book, like I said, in How to See Yourself as You Really Are, he talks about even that level of understanding of how everything arises in dependence upon causes and conditions should give us a lot of material to work with in terms of our interpretation of what's going on in the world around us. We tend to concretize and think that there's one thing responsible. You know, I sometimes use the gun violence issue as an example. You know, a lot of people, when all this was really going very badly in our country, and there were many of these episodes going on, just week after week, you'd hear more and more, especially in schools, which was so sad to see, but it's sad everywhere. But we would, like many people say, well, if you just get rid of these automatic rifles, well, then we'd be free of that problem. Or if you just deal with mental illness of people who do this because of them not being mentally stable, then we get rid of this problem. Or if we do this or we do that, it's complex, right? The situation is not that simple. You know, our ethical decisions and how we are in the world needs to take into consideration that things do not arise independently. They arise dependent upon many factors. His Holiness in some of his writings speaks about all the causes and conditions that led to what happened in Tibet in the 50s in particular, though obviously it was informed by what happened earlier in the 20th century and even centuries prior to that, and conflicts that went on between Tibet and China and what have you. You can't just say it's just one thing that led to anything. It's always this whole chain of causes and conditions. So having some level of understanding of dependent origination can also be helpful in our everyday lives in terms of understanding how things don't come into existence in a sort of independent way. But nonetheless, here we're getting at this deeper reality of understanding how something can't have its own sort of substantial independent entity if it arises on the basis of causes and conditions. Secondly, on the second level, Tyndall, dependent origination or arising, can be understood in terms of the mutual dependence which exists between parts and whole. Without parts, there can be no whole. Without a whole, the concept of parts makes no sense. The idea of whole is predicated on parts, but these parts themselves must be considered to be wholes comprised of their own parts. Just like I was saying when we talk about the parts of a body, you know, human body, and again, Venerable Robina goes into this a little bit in hers, but not as much. She mostly uses causes and conditions in her analysis in that meditation. But feel free to add that additional analysis to the meditation that is again out on the website that you can use for the next week. Investigate how we have a dependence upon parts. What we designate as body, this collection of stuff, has its individual parts. Again, I might generally we can talk about there's the head, the torso, the limbs. Okay, that gets at like most of it, right? Or kind of a way of talking about the body in brief. But any particular limb, such as my right arm, you know, is going to have all its various parts. It's going to have the upper arm, the elbow, the lower arm, the hand. And if I talk about the hand has its own parts. It has the palm, it has the thumb, it has the index finger, middle finger, ring finger, little finger. If I talk about my index finger, the index finger has different parts and so on. Every single thing we go to, you know, the nail on my index finger, every one of those parts has its own wholeness that is existing in relation to its parts. You don't ever have anything that stands up kind of under this type of scrutiny as independently existing as a whole in and of itself, independent of its parts. So this is what His Holiness is getting at with this, is that we come to understand there's a mutual dependence upon these two things, what we call the whole and what we call the parts. And again, when we look at any of the individual parts, then that becomes the whole and it has its own parts. You never really find anything, again, in this whole analysis that's going to be able to withstand some deeper investigation into its independent existence. It doesn't exist independently. On the third level, and he actually talks about this in two ways, which is kind of helpful because you might even find this in your own investigation. He says on the third level, all phenomena can be understood to be dependently originated because when we analyze them, we find that ultimately They lack independent identity. This is the whole thing, is that where does their identity come from? How do we establish what is a clothespin or what is a person? It is a designation, a label that we give to it. But this can be understood from, he says, from the way in which we refer to certain phenomena. For example, the words action and agent presuppose one another. So here he's talking about a form of kind of mutual dependence that is caught up in the way that we refer to things. Can you talk about an action happening without an agent being there as the person who does that action? Can we talk about an agent, an actor, doing anything without the action being there? So do parent and child, right? If we refer to somebody as a parent, then that implies that they have a child or had a child at some point. Whereas, when we talk about somebody being a child, that's definitely, in context of them having had a parent, two parents generally, but, at least one. Someone is a parent only because he or she has children. Likewise, a daughter or son is so called only in relation to them having parents. The same relationship of mutual dependence is seen in the language we use to describe trades or professions. Individuals are called farmers on account of their work on the land. Doctors are so called because of their work in the field of medicine. Teachers are called because they have students who learn from them. Students are called such because they learn from teachers. You have this mutual dependence in regard to how things are labeled. But he's going to get into the subtler way, which is what I was referring to, that mere labeling and designating. He says, in a more subtle way, things and events can be understood in terms of dependent origination when, for example, we ask, what exactly is a clay pot? When we look for something we can describe as its final identity, like we did with the clothespin, we find that the pot's very existence, and by implication that of all other phenomena, is, to some extent, provisional and simply determined by convention, by this way that we come into agreement to calling stuff what it is, like the clothespin and so on. Let's go on to the last little bit of this. When we ask whether its identity is determined by its shape, function, its specific parts, that is, being compounded of clay, water, and so on, we find that the term pot is merely a verbal designation. There is no single characteristic which can be said to identify it, no part, no characteristic quality, nor indeed does the totality of its characteristics. We can imagine pots of different shapes that are no less pots. I mean, everything will fit into that category. And because we can only really speak of its existing in relation to a complex nexus of causes and conditions, viewed from this perspective, it has no single defining quality. In other words, it does not exist in and of itself, but rather is dependently originated. Whoops, went to the slide that I had there from previously. Okay, so this is the, again, I hope it helped to use His Holiness's words from Ethics for the New Millennium, but he was talking there about events. But we can see again how there's these three levels involved in things that are conditioned, that arise from their causes and conditions, that have their various parts, of course, and everything has parts. And then, of course, the designation, the labeling, the conceptualizing that occurs in relation to mutual dependence, where we talk about somebody being a father in relation to them having a child. And then we can talk about the way that we designate something simply because we conventionally determine that that's the label that is appropriate for that, and we give it that identity then. Things don't have an identity from their own side, whether it's a clothespin, a book, a person, whatever the case might be. Nothing exists in and of itself, on its own, autonomously. Rather, everything dependently arising. By the way, I mean, I was really pleased that when this book came out many, many years ago, when His Holiness, first uses dependent arising as the way of beginning to talk about emptiness, it is said to be one of the most powerful reasonings, but it's also one of the easiest for us to begin to work with and get our heads around. And in fact, Venerable Tipton Chodron, who's been working with His Holiness on a number of books now, she talks about how it's actually the easiest way to talk about emptiness if you wanted to talk to people who aren't that involved philosophically in Buddhism, because you can at least begin to help them to see the intricacies involved in things coming into existence. It allows people to maintain an awareness that things do exist in spite of them not existing in this independent way. And that's what I want to talk about next. And then well, actually, let me see if there are questions before I go on to talk about that. I want to talk about the two extremes, but it might be good to do a little check-in because I've been doing an awful lot of talking. Are people clear on these three levels of dependent origination as they apply to clothespin, eye, pot, as His Holiness did? Any questions? The driving point, once more, is that when we finally arrive at that place where we think that in the end, the subtlest way that I exist is a mere imputation, a mere designation. If I know deep in my heart that there's nothing more substantial than that, then there's no target, there's no basis for any of this kind of stuff that I'm reacting to in my world, because those reactions are triggered by my solidifying that sense of self. If it's never solidified, if I am constantly in this presence of understanding its nominal existence, then I won't be triggered in these ways. Triggered in a positive way for all those objects that bring me pleasure that I want to get attached to and hold on to and grasp at and collect and whatever. And I also won't be triggered in a negative way in terms of those things that come into my life that upset my peace, that I then get angry and upset and irritated at and so on. Because none of this there's no real target for it. I have to set up this fictitious target for there to be any of these response or reactions. Rather, if I am abiding in that wisdom of emptiness that sees this very subtle way that I exist, that everything exists, then there's no ground for any of that to arise. That's the whole import of this reasoning. Now, dependent arising, let me go on then, since it doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So dependent arising is said to be the king of reasonings. And why it's called the king of reasonings, not just because it is a bit easier to get our heads around, but it helps you to find this middle way, as was pointed out by His Holiness, between these two extremes. You have two extremes. It's like you're walking along this very narrow pathway that has two chasms on either side, one on either side. The one chasm is where we've already been. That's the chasm of thinking things exist in this independent way, this concrete way, this solid way, having their own identity. And that's, of course, what we have to get ourselves out of, to the middle way. What happens sometimes is when we get these teachings that kind of take us out of that chasm and we start to find the middle way, we fall over into the other one. The other one, as I alluded to earlier, is the chasm of nihilism. It's where we annihilate things. We think things don't exist at all. Like if this can't have clothespinness from its own side, then there can't be a clothespin. And actually, a lot of other Buddhist thinkers will come to the conclusion that there must be clothespinness, or else we couldn't identify this as a clothespin. There must be some bookness from the side of what's in my hand, or we couldn't identify this as a book. There must be some I here, or I couldn't identify this as I. In reality, there is nothing from the side of any of those bases that is the I, the book, the clothespin. Rather, everything is, again, merely imputed, merely designated. But it doesn't deny its existence, because it does exist. It exists in a very subtle way. Like I said, what his Rinpoche says, it's almost as if it doesn't exist. It's almost as if things aren't existing. Why? Because they're only nominally existent. But nominally existent is good enough. It gets us there. Things still do exist. In fact, this is how things have always existed. You've never been more than a mere imputation of I on the basis of aggregates, these physical and mental components of our being. I started using terminology I've been using on Wednesday. I don't like to introduce aggregates so much in these introductory classes like Discovering Buddhism, but this is the term the Buddha used to refer to this basis for a being, the mind and body. And he divided it a little bit further down. But anyway, we have this mind-body collection, this mind-body complex that we think of as I. And that's all that there is to the I. It's just a thought of I in relation to this. Just like there's a thought of book in relation to the phenomenon that has the front cover, back cover, pages, spine, dust cover, all the various parts of a book. Those are the basis for a book. Book is a label we give to book, or to this collection of stuff, sorry, that we identify as book, that conventionally we agree upon as book. There's no bookness from the side of those parts. Book is simply the label we give to that. So again, when we are able to do that, we find this middle way, because we don't fall into this chasm of nihilism, because we're still saying things exist. I've never at any time in today's lecture, hopefully I've not made a mistake and said things don't exist. The Buddha never said that things don't exist. And as I said earlier today, if we went to that extreme, it wouldn't make sense at all. If the Buddha's whole purpose in coming here was to say, guess what, folks, you don't exist at all. Everything around you doesn't exist. Okay, well, why do I keep having problems then? Why is it that the things are still, challenging for me and so on? That we never get to that extreme. The Buddha saying things don't exist at all. So if things exist, then we have to get back to how do they exist? We don't want to fall into this chasm and think that they exist independently, autonomously, on their own, concretely. Rather, we want to find this middle way where we can say things do exist in this very, very subtle way, not the way we thought they did through our ignorance, and not in an utter non-existence. Because utter non-existence, again, doesn't really make much sense. Then you couldn't uphold anything. You couldn't uphold Buddhahood, the path to enlightenment that we're learning in this course, and so on. Things do exist, but they exist in this very subtle way. So even, I'll get to, I think there's a question in the chat box. I'll get to that in just a moment. There is this term dependent arising. In and of itself, it can be seen as indicating the middle way. So if we talk about this chasm over here as being independent existence, the word dependent means that this can't be true, right? We can't fall into that extreme and think things exist independently if we come to understand that they're dependent. So we get rid of that chasm. Now, this chasm over here means that things don't exist at all. In other words, they don't arise. Well, the other word of this term was arising, origination. Things do come into existence. They just do so in a dependent way. It's not that they lack existence entirely. So we get rid of that chasm. So we find the middle way that's between these two. It doesn't cause us to think things exist independently, on their own, substantially from their own side, nor do we fall into an extreme where we think things don't exist at all. And then we think karma doesn't exist. Nothing exists. I don't exist. You don't exist. That's the danger of this view, is that if we don't apply it correctly, we could never get out of the chasm we're in, which is the problems we're already been having, and we might fall into the chasm of thinking things don't exist at all. So if we have to find this exact middle way between these two. So let me see. The comment says, I got lost when you mentioned that emptiness as a phenomenon is not a product of causes and conditions. Can you briefly explain again? Maybe I misunderstood. Okay. Yeah, it's a tricky one to get into. Phenomena that are negations or cessations, I talked about this a little bit on Wednesday night. And again, Wednesday night's class is a little more involved investigation of emptiness, but these are all phenomena that we consider unchanging. So if I talk about, and I used this example the other night, I think it's a perfectly fine example. Each of you are in a room somewhere, I assume. I doubt that you're outside today. It's pretty chilly outside today, but you're probably in a room, and you can talk about the absence of an elephant in that room, right? And again, I'm not talking about the way that we say, oh, nobody's talking about the elephant in the room, that colloquial phrase that we have. I'm talking about a real elephant, like, let's say a baby elephant, so it's not like this totally inconceivable thing. Somebody might have a baby elephant. Somebody, visits them with a baby elephant. And they might have their baby elephant in a room for a moment or two, but, we don't have an elephant in the room, right? Every one of us is dealing with the lack of an elephant in our room. That's a negation. That's an absence. Does that absence change moment by moment? Right now, when I think about the absence of the elephant in the room, is it different than 5 minutes ago? Or 5 minutes from now, when I think about the absence of the elephant in the room? My thoughts are changing. I'm not saying that side of it, but the absence itself, does it change? It doesn't change, because the absence at point A in time is the same as the absence at point B in time. There's no difference in the absence. It's an absence. It's a negation. So this is an example of a phenomenon that we would say is permanent, unchanging. For the duration of time that there is no elephant in this room, from whenever this room first, because I don't think there's ever been an elephant in this room, from the time this room was formed till the time this room is destroyed, there probably won't be any change in that negation of an elephant in the room. an absence of an elephant in the room. See, we're getting into conceptual kind of phenomena. And that's what emptiness is to some degree, but emptiness is also a reality that we can know. But when we talk about it as the same sort of thing, it's an absence, a negation of inherent existence, independent existence, on the basis of this collection of stuff, at the absence of a real I. Well, then that absence doesn't change moment by moment. That real I has never been there. That independent I has never been there. It doesn't change moment by moment. And it's not produced from any sort of causes and conditions. The I is, without a doubt, because there are a lot of factors, as we explored earlier, that gave rise to this I being here. But the absence of inherent existence of this I, that has never existed. I'm sorry, it has always existed. The inherent existence has never existed. So the absence has always been there as long as the I was there, and it will continue in an unchanging manner until I cease to exist. And I mean here by the temporary I that I am, that is this person that I'm referring to as Don, which without a doubt will go out of existence at some point in the future. So the emptiness of Don will go out of existence when Don goes out of existence. It came into existence when Don came into existence, but it's not changing from the point it started till the point it ended. It's always the absence of inherent existence. Again, it's kind of hard to get into this, gets into headier kind of ideas and concepts in Buddhism. All those phenomena that fit into that category, that are negations, absences, and so on, they are unchanging moment by moment. So they are different than books and clothespins and people and various other things in our physical world that arise from causes and conditions. You know, whatever those impermanent phenomena are, they change moment by moment. I'm a changing being going through, I'm not the same person I was when I was 5 years old, nor when I was 15 years old or 25 years old and so on. But the emptiness of Don was the same throughout all of that, completely unchanging. Does that make some sense, Victor? A bit clearer. So again, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because I think that's a bit, difficult to kind of get our heads around and be completely, understanding of. But nonetheless, this is the way that we can talk about these three levels of dependent origination. Is the first one does only apply to those things that have causes and conditions. Because otherwise, if I said emptiness depends upon its causes and conditions, what would its causes and conditions be? It's a negation of inherent existence of this, or of this, or of this, or of this. While those things that I pointed to were all changing moment by moment, the emptiness doesn't change. So it doesn't have any causes and conditions. It doesn't have anything that gives rise to it. It is always there, and it always has been there as an absence of inherent existence on whatever basis. And everything is kind of arising together with its emptiness. We can talk about the emptiness of the clothespin, which is what we should discern by seeing its dependent arising through those three levels. We can talk about the emptiness of the book by discerning the three levels of dependent arising with regard to that. We can even talk about the emptiness of emptiness. I'm going to blow your mind now. Anyway, because emptiness also depends upon its parts and depends upon designation. We designate emptiness. We label emptiness to an idea, the lack of independent existence, the lack of inherent existence, autonomous existence, whatever terms we use. That is also merely labeled. So all phenomena depend upon imputation and depend upon their parts. Conditioned phenomena, impermanent phenomena, depend upon their causes and conditions. Okay, so I hope I've clarified a little bit more and not made the waters muddier. But so what I was talking about again are those two extremes. What we have again is we are already holding things quite concretely. This extreme is usually called like the extreme of eternalism or absolutism, kind of thinking that there's some sort of concrete entity within things. And then we adhere to that, sometimes even called the extreme of permanence, but let's not go there because we're introducing kind of different ideas here. But this extreme that kind of reifies things, that puts them into this category, like I said, we've already been there in terms of our own operating in samsara. We think that things exist in this concrete, independent, autonomous way. That's this view that's sort of eternalistic, absolutistic, that just thinks that things have that. Well, when we begin to study these teachings on emptiness, we start moving away from that. And we might, run through this middle way, but we can often fall over into this other extreme. As I was saying, that's the extreme of the nihilistic view that thinks that things are annihilated. When we come to understand their emptiness, it means they don't exist at all. Well, the Buddha, again, never said this, and this wouldn't make sense to say that you don't exist. You're here. You're listening to these teachings. Of course you exist. So maybe that's enough for today. It's already pretty close to 12:30. I didn't touch quite much on this topic of things being illusory. As I said, it's just a little reference that His Holiness makes, and we'll maybe get into that a little bit later in the course or maybe next class. But we do come to that conclusion then that how things exist and how they appear are not in line with each other. Because, like I said, when I held this up originally, I'm sure every one of you said, oh, look, Don's holding a clothespin. Its clothespinness seemed to be coming from this stuff on the side of the screen, that it was identified as such. It had its own entity, its own identity out here on these parts. That's how it appears, and that's how we apprehend it, how we think of it. But as we saw, even with this reasoning of dependent arising, we can come to understand that it actually is different phenomenon than how it appears, because it exists in dependence upon its parts and conditions, in dependence upon its parts. I say causes and conditions, yeah, causes and conditions and parts, and then finally it exists in dependence upon us labeling it as clothespin. It has no clothespin-ness from its own side. That is an illusion that is happening that seems to be projecting its own identity. That's again why we buy into it so easily. Why our ignorance arises so easily is because things appear that way. I appear to be inherently existent. The bowl appears to be inherently existent. My computer appears to be inherently existent. This is the big problem, is that we have this appearance as well. I think some of the readings that, if you're doing any of the additional readings in Lama Zopa's books, are really helpful, because he really highlights that element of it, that there's a false appearance as well as our adherence to that. So we're grasping at something that appears to us as real, and it doesn't have that reality at all. That's why it's very hard to undermine this ignorance. So hopefully today we've gotten at least our toe in the water. Maybe we've taken a dive into the deep end, I'm not sure, but at least begin to understand that there are ways that we can begin to undermine these mistaken ideas that are guiding our stay in samsara and our unenlightened existence. And the very first one is the reasoning of dependent arising, which, as I said, is a really important one to get at how things actually do exist in the midst of their emptiness. They're lacking any independent existence. Well, that's because they have dependent existence. All right. So again, there is a meditation I'd encourage you to do over the next week, the one I mentioned earlier from Venerable Robina, and expand on it if you wish to include the other levels of dependent origination. See if you can not just see all the various causes and conditions. I think she may talk about parts again in there as part of that meditation. I haven't gone back to review it for today, but she doesn't get to the extent of labeling, I don't think. So it might be good to introduce that in your meditation. See if you can see that there's no real body here, just the idea of body on the basis of these parts that are a suitable basis for calling it body. This is what we've agreed to call these collections of parts that have a head and a torso and limbs and what have you. So, okay, good. Let's do some dedication prayers then, if there are no questions. Okay. So if Mary could share those. Is Mary still with us? Did she got knocked off somehow? Anyway, maybe she had to go. I'm not sure. So let's just do, I don't have prayers lined up here with the files. Let's just do a few prayers of dedication to conclude. So we can think very strongly that through the force of this merit, may we become a Buddha and then lead all sentient beings to that same state. And we can recall bodhicitta, this very powerful mind that aspires to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of all sentient beings. May this develop very deeply in our own hearts and in the hearts of all beings. And then let's dedicate also for the good health and long lives of our precious teachers, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Osalhita, who is Lama Yeshe's reincarnation, all the other holy beings who are in this world who are guiding us and others. may we always have the good fortune of being with these beings and having all the perfect conditions to study with them, to practice with them. And then lastly, let's dedicate for anyone that we're holding in our hearts right now, those beings who are experiencing suffering, difficulties, problems, who have illness, who are dying or who have died. Send this positive energy out to them. Think that they receive it, becomes the cause to alleviate their suffering immediately, and for them to find everything that will bring them true happiness and peace. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through what we've done here today. So I hope this has been, somewhat clear. Again, I did the best that I could with today and to put all of this into this one session, but I would really encourage you to read His Holiness's book, particularly the chapters that we've gone through in terms of dependent arising in that. And then if you want to prepare for next week, you can read ahead to those chapters. So we already did the prayers, Mary. We just did a kind of shortened form of dedication. You may have hit the wrong button or something. It just happens to me sometimes too, or I don't know.
No, my internet went out for a second.
Oh, okay.
It's shut down. Now it's back. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Well, thank you for your support today, and thank you all for being here. And hopefully see most of you tomorrow, but definitely see you next Saturday, barring any acts of gross impermanence. So, okay. Be well, everyone. Stay
Thank
safe.
you. Thank